We've read the Christmas story in Luke 2, verses 1 to 7, dozens of times. We know every detail off by heart. One of the most poignant phrases is the little phrase, "There was no room for them in the inn." And we can be rather hard on the poor innkeeper. After all, surely he could have found some room for a very pregnant woman and her husband. And yet, we need to remember that this is not the First World Hotel in Malaysia, currently the largest hotel in the world. Do you know how many rooms it has? 7,351 rooms. This was not like that. This was a small backwater B&B in a small backwater town called Bethlehem, in a small, to be honest, backwater country called Israel. And these were tough times, hard times, times when there wasn't a lot of peace to go around. There wasn't a lot of hope. There wasn't a whole lot of love happening either. And yet give the Bethlehemites credit, because they did find them a place to stay, albeit in a stable. That little phrase, "there was no room for them in the inn," reminds us that Jesus was born in a stable. And that reminds us of three of the great miracles associated with Christmas. The first is the miracle of the lowly. Miracle of the lowly. Now, the second verse of Away in a Manger begins, "The cattle were lowing." I'm not referring to that kind of lowliness. It isn't a miracle that cattle low. What is a miracle is that there were cattle present when Jesus was born. There is a miracle of lowliness associated with his birth. Had there been a Bethlehem Hilton, God could have commandeered a room there. Had there been a Bethlehem General Hospital, God could have found the delivery suite available for Mary. There could have been room in the inn if God had so directed things. But God chose to allow his son to be born in a stable. God made the deliberate choice to allow his only son, Jesus, to be born as the most lowly of the low. It was not the nice, quaint stable that we celebrate in our creche at home. It was, like 1,000 other stables, crowded with smelly animals, dark, damp, and rodent infested. It was an all-round rotten place to give birth to a baby. That kind of shocks us and offends us. We prefer the romantic, almost fairy tale picture of Joseph and Mary glowing with wonder and worship in a rather antiseptic stable. But it was not that way, on purpose. That's the miracle. The point of Christmas is that Jesus does not come as royalty. With all due respect to Her Majesty the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen has an estimated annual income of $80 million Canadian, give or take 10 to 20 million, depending on who you ask. The reality is that the Queen and her family don't understand my life. They don't understand the lives that any of us lead. They're out of touch. On the eve of the French Revolution, the ordinary people were rising against their king and queen, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette. One of the chief reasons for the French Revolution is that the aristocracy, including the king, were so out of touch with the suffering of ordinary people. They were living lives of decadence and luxury while ordinary people starved. During one noisy demonstration at the palace gate, Marie Antoinette supposedly asked what the ruckus was all about. And when her servants replied, "It's the peasants, they want bread," she supposedly said, "Bread! Let them eat cake!" The reality is princes cannot identify with us ordinary people. They live in a different world. The miracle of the lowly is that Jesus was not born in a palace. He was born in a stable. You don't get much more lowly than that. So we can't accuse Jesus of aristocratic advantage. He can identify with a baby born in Cameroon or in Canada, in a refugee camp or Red Deer, in a shelter or the Chinook Regional Hospital. God sends his son to experience life in all of its earthiness, in all of its lowliness. His first breath was laden with animal odors. The first noises he heard were the grunts of livestock. The first clothes he wore were cloths from a stable. From day one, God's choice was to allow his Son to experience life on earth in all its lowliness. Why? Well, imagine if God had sent his Son as a prince. Would a prince experience life as ordinary people do, as you and I do? Would he live where ordinary people live? Would he eat what ordinary people eat? Would he wear what ordinary people wear? Would he experience financial stress, health problems, family problems, and the host of other things that ordinary people experience? Of course not. And so when people like us experience the challenges of real life, we would have a God who can't identify with us in the least because he never experienced any of that. For many of us in Canada, that may not be such a big deal because we're not princes and princesses, but we still live fairly comfortable lives. But in places where the church is growing by leaps and bounds, among refugees, in Africa, in parts of Asia, in places where people are poor, are amongst the most lowly in the world, that's where the church is growing. Why? Because they discover a Savior who can identify with the lowliness of life. We don't have a God who came as a prince. We have a God who came as the lowest of the low. Even for us, it's good to know that we have a Savior who actually can empathize with us and comfort us in the muck and mire of life, from weariness to sorrow, from financial stress to the loss of loved ones, from hunger to betrayal, from life through death. The miracle of the lowly is this: no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what you're facing, Jesus has been there and done that. We don't have a Savior who's some great prince way above us. We have a Savior who's come as the lowest of the low. He comes alongside each and every one of us. That's good news for us, and it's good news for our world, that no matter who we know who is struggling, Jesus can come alongside them. Jesus is our good news.